Hello, my name is Josiah Boucher, and I'm going to be presenting our paper, Is Resistance Futile? Early Career Game Developers, Generative AI, and AI Resistance. We come from Interactive Media and Game Development program at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. So here's the kind of roadmap for the presentation. I'm going to start by talking about the research, the motivation, and the study itself, and the data collection and analysis. Then we're going to move into the findings. We found a lot of friction and themes of ethics, agency, ownership, usability, utility, efficacy, and we want to talk a little bit about how we interpreted the resistance we found in the interns. And then finally, we're going to talk about why this kind of matters. So we want to talk about emerging professional communities as GAI develops, conceptualizing AI as a tool, how this might integrate with games education moving forward, and then some closing thoughts. So we're going to start off with the research, the motivation behind this. So who are we looking at and why are we looking there? We wanted to look at we wanted to respond to the explosion of generative AI tools and media attention that was focused there. Furthermore, we wanted to kind of narrow our search. There was a lot of general talk about generative AI, but there wasn't as much research being done at the time about specific areas of interest. So we wanted to better understand exactly how AI was manifesting in games industry workspaces. So we decided to look at a particular workspace to expand on that. So this is the Summer Innovation Program. This is a program run by MassDigi. They do this every year. They've done it for over 10 years, and it's a really great program where these are young professionals who are working on a professional team for their first time. They have a ton of freedom to do what they want to. They work in teams making mobile games in Unity over 11 weeks in the summer. And very few rules are imposed on these teams. The program director tries to nudge them in the right direction, but they, for the most part, can do whatever they want. There's a strong focus on professional development in this program, and it feels a lot like an industry workplace because they try to make it like that. They also have a lot of networking events throughout the duration of the program so that they can meet people in the industry and get a feel for what that's like and talk to them about their development. They were also kind of responding to this explosion of media attention in AI. The director wanted to encourage the interns to use generative AI tools for their work to develop their skill set and kind of get ahead of the curve. So, data collection. I attended the full duration of the program as an embedded researcher. I sat in their workspace, I attended their events, and I talked to these interns and the program director every day that I was there. So data collection kind of came in two forms. The first is semi-structured interviews. Some of these were group interviews with each of the teams, but most of them were individual interviews with interns who volunteered. For the most part, everybody was really excited to talk to me about this. As I said, everybody was a volunteer. Uh, these interviews tended to be pretty short. The average duration was only about 9 minutes. And part of this was because I didn't want to be disruptive to their work, but I also didn't feel like it was necessary to conduct longer interviews because of the embedded nature of this research. Leading to the second form of data collection, through the daily fieldwork and participatory observation, I had a really strong sense of the program that informed the research process. So this meant that interviews were more often expanding on a topic I had already discussed with an intern rather than bringing up something new for the first time and needing to start from scratch. As I mentioned, in the data collection, the contextual information from the observation and fieldwork played a significant role in informing the analysis of the data. While this aspect of the study didn't produce quotable material for publication, they did provide critical context for analyzing the data and played a vital role in forming our conclusions. So we used thematic analysis, and this took the form of two phases. The first involved iteratively coding the data as it came in throughout the duration of the program. Every week, the authors of this paper, myself included, would sit down, look at the gathered data, the quotes generated from interviews, and the field notes, and we would use it to code the data. This iterative process allowed each week's progress to further inform interpretation of the data moving forward. We reached a major milestone in the fourth week of the program, and here we observed that the experiences expressed in group interviews early on continued to be repeated in individual interviews in the following weeks. Reflecting on this caused us to shift our approach moving forward. We decided to focus not strictly on some of the tool usage elements that we were thinking about, but we expanded our research domain to consider the intern's professional development and future career visions. Toward the end of the program, the intern's practices became more ingrained and we were able to expand on our initial findings regarding the tool usage. But this dynamic approach to fieldwork really ultimately enriched our interview data and allowed us to better capture the depth of the interns' experiences. So we used an informal inductive and deductive coding approach, trying to privilege semantic and experiential analysis, and this first phase culminated in 4 surface level categories that we used as codes to tag our data. This was very valuable moving forward to the second phase of analysis, which occurred after the completion of the program. This allowed us to look back at all the data with a much greater understanding. This part of analysis took a more deductive approach, allowing us to bring more context into the data, and we brought in conversations with the program directors, documents from the interns' processes, and theory and research from others to refine our initial thematic categorization. And this resulted in identifying much deeper themes in the data. Now we're going to talk about the findings. Given all the excitement and hype we'd seen around AI, we were surprised to see everybody started with a general skepticism of generative AI tools. We also found that artists and programmers resisted it in very different ways. Programmers changed their perspective over time and grew accustomed to using generative AI tools, but the artists found them mostly unsuitable, finding that they replaced their workflow rather than augmenting it. The next theme that we wanted to talk about is ethics, agency, and ownership. So the most strongly expressed resistance came from artists with ethical concerns. These topics usually included copyright, art theft, data training, compensation, etc. The artists were more open to the use of AI if it wouldn't be used in the final product, so things like concept art and that sort of thing. We also found that a driving question behind this friction was a question of power. So the artists were often asking who benefits from the use of these tools and how. They expressed a tension behind actually integrating these tools into their workflow and the motivations behind doing so. The next are more practical concerns. So artists questioned common assumptions about generative AI, such as increased efficiency, and expressed concern that these common assumptions are taken for granted. Here's a quote that captures the sentiment from the artists of the program. "The amount of time that it took me to try and get it to work ended up being more time than it would take if I just drew it normally." So this sort of difficulty that they found came in the form of images lacking layers, undesirable image resolutions, and other technical details that artists are working with at a low level every day, but others don't necessarily think about. In contrast, while the programmers initially resisted these AI tools, over time they found it to align with their existing workflows. This resulted in interns expressing perceptions of easily usable tools that brought value to their workflow. So SIP provides a really unique context where the entire program was for the intern's benefit, and the director saw this as an opportunity for them to develop AI skills, but they resisted these AI tools despite that. And again, there were huge differences between artists and programmers that really came down to the fact that generative AI tools aligned with and augmented the programmers' workflows, whereas the tools tended to replace the work of the artists. Programmers expressed that they didn't view code as their own work, so they had fewer issues with the tools trained on data taken from others, whereas artists, on the other hand, had a deeper ethical questions to grapple with because generative AI tools were producing the final product of their work rather than just one part of it. Alright, so here we want to look to the future, taking our findings and identifying important things to keep in mind as the technology develops further. So we want to highlight that many of the public conversations and predictions about the future of generative AI tend to focus too narrowly on the individual user of generative AI tools. The artists in our study tended to see themselves as connected to the greater community. So we want to ask the question, how will generative AI shape the professional community moving forward? We also want to highlight that for many of the interns, these are their first ever professionally produced games, and they worked on them while being encouraged to use generative AI tools. So in a sense, they'll become some of the first AI native game developers. So it's important to look at how they responded to these tools and take them seriously. They didn't blindly accept generative AI, but they navigated the landscape simultaneously with and against generative AI. We think that moving forward, it's going to be important to look at the impact these tools have on communities more so than individuals. And the reason here is twofold. First, there's the element of common practices of tool use. Why, how, and when is a tool used and what for? But as an additional and richer layer, how does this technology support developers in creating the experiences they want to put in their games? How does generative AI facilitate better game development? Next, we want to think about conceptualizing this as a tool. So, how can a future generative AI technology respond to the resistance displayed? We think one element of this is that it will be important for us to create generative AI technologies that honor and are responsive to the resistance displayed by current young professionals. Much of the intern's resistance to generative AI is responding to dominant narratives of these tools as productivity enhancers, time savers, and replacements for labor. These narratives run counter to the values held by this generation of artists, designers, and with some exception, programmers. So we interpret the intern's resistance to generative AI as a reflection of their skepticism about these new ways of thinking, as well as their fear of generative AI's dominance in the field. Interns' comments suggest that what is needed is a future of generative AI that honors and empowers the current practices and values held by creators. Generative AI technologies are often viewed as tools. In some ways, this distances it from the discourse of replacing human labor, but tools are also often viewed as neutral, passive, or impartial. We propose instead reconceptualizing them as a medium for expression, empowering artists in creative expression, and providing a richer framework for conceptualizing the role this technology can play. We're coming from an academic development program, so naturally we care about how game education can respond to generative AI. As these new technologies are integrated into educational programs, we think it's going to be important to give students space for exploration and self-reflection. We also found that comments from interns on ethical concerns were often mingled with their comments on practical and legal concerns, so I think the students could have benefited from more clear language to support different ways of thinking. While the interns of SIP were encouraged to use generative AI tools, many of the artists found it difficult to do so. Most of them said it was faster to do something from scratch by hand, but they may have found a different experience if they had put more time and effort into developing their prompt engineering skills. There was very little motivation for them to do so in this program, as they were already so focused on developing their more traditional skills in a professional environment for the first time. It could be beneficial to see this sort of skill cultivated in an educational environment. The future of generative AI in the games industry is uncertain, but it's important to document the ongoing efforts to build sensibilities, attitudes, and skills of this developing professional community. Despite the hype around this technology, we found that the interns' response was anything but straightforward. They resisted, negotiated, and reimagined generative AI as they learned to navigate the changing landscape. It is critical to take the skepticism of these early career professionals seriously, especially because their resistance was primarily a response to their need to navigate the changing game design landscape. When they expressed their skepticism, their ethical commitments to fellow game developers and the future of their profession were just as important as their practical concerns. We see in this emerging community an implicit concern for a future that diverges from prevalent corporate talk around AI, one that builds tools that work with their users rather than working to replace them. Thank you.